In a quiet corner of a busy city, where the noise of traffic outside was just a distant hum, there was a small apartment filled with the warm light of the late afternoon. Inside, the air was still, except for the soft movements of a young woman. She was busy with her usual weekend chores, moving around the room with a cloth in her hand, wiping away the dust that had settled during the long week. Her eyes landed on the large, heavy object that sat against the far wall. It was an upright piano, dark and polished, though the polish had faded a bit over the years. It wasn't a grand concert instrument that you would see in a fancy hall, but it had character. For a long time, it had just been a piece of furniture, a place where she stacked books or left her coffee cup. But lately, she had felt a pull toward it. She walked over and ran her duster along the top, watching the dust motes dance in the beam of sunlight that hit the wood. She finished wiping the lid and then, without really thinking about it, she sat down on the bench. The cushion let out a soft sigh of air under her weight. She rested her fingers on the keys. They felt cool and smooth. It had been months since she had seriously played anything. Life had just gotten in the way. Work, bills, and the endless rush of the day made it hard to find time for music. She felt a little rusty, maybe even a bit guilty for neglecting the instrument. She lifted her hands and struck a chord. It wasn't perfect. One of the strings was slightly out of tune, giving the sound a faint, melancholic buzz. But instead of being annoyed by the imperfection, she found it comforting. It felt real. It felt like the instrument had a voice of its own, a story to tell. She began to play, not trying to perform a difficult sonata or a complex jazz piece. She just let her fingers wander. They found a path of white keys, jumping lightly from one to the next. A melody began to form. It was something very simple, a tune that felt familiar, like a lullaby from a distant childhood memory or a folk song heard in a dream. It was just a few notes rising up and then floating back down, innocent and pure. She played it once. Then she played it again, slower this time. The notes hung in the quiet room, ringing out clearly before fading into silence. There was something about this simple progression that caught her off guard. It wasn't showy or complicated, yet it held a strange kind of power. It seemed to tug at something deep inside her chest, a feeling she couldn't quite name. She stopped playing and let her hands fall into her lap. The apartment was silent again, but the tune was still echoing in her mind. She hummed it softly to herself, testing the rhythm against her breath. Usually, when she played things like this, she would get bored quickly and move on to something harder. But today was different. Today, the simple tune felt like a seed waiting to be planted. Curious, she placed her fingers back on the keys and tried to change it. She added a harmony here, a small extra note there. She wanted to see how far she could push this little melody before it broke. She played the original line in her left hand while her right hand tried to find a partner for it. As the notes intertwined, a shiver went down her spine. It sounded beautiful. It sounded like a conversation between two old friends. Suddenly, the tiredness she felt from her chores vanished. Her posture straightened. She wasn't just a woman cleaning her house anymore, she was an explorer discovering a new world. The piano stopped being a dusty piece of furniture and became a living, breathing partner. She played the phrase over and over, each time adding a tiny bit more detail. A pause here. A stretch of the fingers there. She started to hear things that weren't there yet. She imagined the sound of a cello joining in, or a soft violin weeping in the background. The simple tune was growing legs, it wanted to walk somewhere. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the floorboards. The room grew cooler, but she didn't notice. She was completely lost in the music. She realized that she had stumbled upon something special. It wasn't just a nice sound, it was a story that wanted to be told. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She looked around for something to write on. Grabbing a notepad from the side table and a pen that was running low on ink, she balanced the paper on the music rack. She didn't know proper notation perfectly, but she knew enough to write down the letters of the notes and draw the little squiggles that would remind her of the rhythm. She scribbled furiously, afraid that if she didn't catch it, the idea would fly away like a bird through the open window. C, E, G, then up to A. She hummed as she wrote, checking and rechecking that what was on the paper matched what was in her head. When she finished writing the main line, she sat back and looked at the messy scribbles. It looked so small on the page. Just a few lines of ink. But when she looked at those notes, she didn't just see dots, she saw possibilities. She saw landscapes, rain, and sunshine. She felt a spark of excitement that she hadn't felt in years. She looked out the window at the city lights flickering on in the twilight. Everyone else was rushing home, eating dinner, or watching television. But in this small room, she had found a secret. She had started with a simple tune, something anyone could play. But as she looked back at the piano, she knew it wasn't going to stay simple for long. It had a hold on her now. It was demanding to be heard, to be expanded, to be nurtured into something much bigger than she ever expected. Taking a deep breath, she placed her hands on the keys one last time, ready to see where the music would take her next. The simple melody she had found was like a small seed, but now it was time for it to grow. In the beginning, she just played it over and over, letting the notes sink into her memory until she didn't even have to look at her hands. But after a few days, the repetition started to feel a little empty. It was like saying the same word over and over again until it loses its meaning. She knew that if she wanted this to be something real, something that could touch other people, she had to take a risk. She had to change it. She started with the bass. The melody was high and light, floating like a cloud, but it needed something to hold it down. She began to experiment with her left hand, pressing down the lower keys while the right hand kept the tune. At first, she just played single notes, a steady beat like a drum. But that felt too boring, too predictable. She tried playing groups of notes chords. She pressed 3 keys down at once. Boom. The sound was rich and full. It gave the melody a backbone. She spent the next week just trying to find the right match for her simple tune. Some chords made the happy song sound sad, like it was crying. Others made it sound angry. She spent one whole evening playing the same 8 measures over and over, changing just one chord in the middle every time. She closed her eyes and listened. Did she want it to sound hopeful? Did she want it to sound like a storm? She realized that the music could be anything she wanted it to be. It was like holding clay in her hands, she could shape it however she liked. As the weeks turned into a month, her life began to change around the music. She stopped turning on the television in the evenings. She stopped scrolling through her phone for hours. Instead, as soon as she got home from work, she would take off her coat, make a cup of tea, and sit at the piano. The apartment grew quiet, except for the sound of her playing. Her neighbors probably thought she was strange. They would hear the same tune drifting through the walls, but it would sound different every night. Sometimes it was fast and frantic, her fingers flying across the keys in a blur. Other nights, it was so slow and quiet that you almost had to hold your breath to hear it. She was no longer just playing a song, she was having a conversation with the piano. The real challenge came when she decided to make it bigger. She started to hear things in her head that weren't on the paper. She imagined violins playing a long, high note that stretched out forever. She could hear drums crashing in the distance. But she only had 10 fingers and one piano. She had to figure out how to make one instrument sound like a whole orchestra. This was the hard part. She started to weave the melody into more complicated patterns. Instead of playing the tune straight through, she broke it apart. She took a tiny piece of it, just the first 3 notes, and played them faster, turning them into a waterfall of sound. Then she took the middle part and played it deep down in the lower keys, making it sound heavy and serious. It was frustrating work. There were nights when she wanted to scream. Her fingers would cramp up, and her brain felt tired. She would hit a wrong note, a jarring sound that ruined the mood, and she would have to stop and shake her hands out. "Why am I doing this?" she would ask the empty room. It would have been so much easier to just play a pop song from the radio or to watch a movie. But every time she thought about quitting, she would play the simple version of the tune one last time. And somehow, it would pull her back in. She knew there was magic hiding inside those notes, and she was the only one who could let it out. She began to experiment with tension. In music, not every sound is supposed to be pretty. She learned that if she played certain notes together, they would clash. It sounded wrong, like a disagreement. But if she held that clash for just a second longer and then resolved it into a sweet, smooth chord, the release felt incredible. It was like stretching a rubber band until it hurt and then letting go. She started to build these moments of tension into the piece. She wanted the people listening to lean forward, to wonder what was coming next, to feel a little bit worried before the music made them feel safe again. The paper on her music rack was becoming a mess. She had crossed out so many notes and scribbled in new ones that it was hard to read the original melody. She used pencils, pens, and even colored markers to try to make sense of the chaos. She drew little arrows to remind herself which way the music was supposed to go. It wasn't neat, but it was alive. Every mark on the paper was a decision she had made, a problem she had solved. One rainy Tuesday, something clicked. She was working on the middle section of the piece, the part that was supposed to be the most emotional. She had been struggling with it for days. It felt too messy, too crowded with notes. In a moment of frustration, she lifted her hands high and brought them down with force, not caring about being gentle. The piano roared. The sound filled the entire apartment, vibrating the floor and the windows. For a second, she was scared of the noise she had made. But then, the sound faded away, and she was left with a ringing in her ears. She sat there, stunned. That was it. That was the sound she was looking for. It wasn't about being delicate all the time. Sometimes the music needed to be big and loud. It needed to fill the space. She quickly wrote down what she had played, her heart racing with excitement. She realized that the simple tune she started with was still there, buried under all the fancy notes and loud chords, but now it was stronger. It wasn't just a cute little tune anymore. It had muscles. She played it from the beginning. She started with the soft, simple notes, just like she did on that first afternoon. Then she added the heartbeat of the bass. Then she moved into the stormy middle section she had just discovered, letting her hands get heavy and loud. Finally, she brought it back down to the quiet ending. She played the last chord and lifted her hands off the keys. The silence that followed felt heavy and important. She sat still for a long time, just breathing. It was late. The street lights outside had turned on, casting orange shadows on the floor. Her back ached, and her eyes burned from focusing so hard. But she didn't feel tired anymore. She felt a deep sense of satisfaction, like a runner who just finished a long race. She looked at the piles of crumpled paper on the floor and the scribbled notebook on the rack. This wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was becoming a masterpiece, note by difficult note. She stood up, stretched her arms over her head, and walked to the window to look at the city below. Everyone was going about their lives, but up here, she had built a whole world out of a simple tune. And she knew she wasn't done yet. The best parts were still waiting to be found. For a while, the music was like a runaway train. It was exciting and fast, and she was just trying to hang on. But as the months passed, the excitement started to turn into something heavy. The piece she was writing was no longer just a song, it was becoming a monster. Every time she sat down to play, she felt like she had to add more. If a part was quiet, she thought it was boring. If a melody was simple, she thought it was too easy. She wanted to impress the world, even if the only people watching were her four walls. Her sheet music, which had started as a few clean lines on a page, was now a chaotic mess. She had scribbled notes in the margins, drawn arrows pointing up and down, and used so much eraser that the paper was starting to tear. The music was filled with complicated runs fast, tricky patterns of notes that raced up and down the keyboard like spiders. Her fingers would ache after practicing them, cramping up from the effort to be perfect. She was practicing 6 hours a day, sometimes skipping meals or forgetting to call her friends back. She thought this was what it meant to be a serious artist. She thought suffering for the art was necessary. But somewhere along the way, she lost the connection. One evening, she sat down to play the piece from start to finish. She took a deep breath, placed her hands on the keys, and launched into the opening. It was loud and aggressive. She played the complicated chords with force, pounding the keys to make them sound angry. Then she flew into the fast sections, her hands moving so fast they were almost a blur. But when she finished the last crashing chord, she didn't feel the usual rush of happiness. She just felt tired. She looked at the piano, confused. The room was silent again. She tried to think about what she had just played. Technically, it was difficult. It showed off how fast her fingers could move and how hard she could hit the keys. But emotionally, it felt empty. It felt like she was shouting just to hear her own voice. She couldn't find the simple tune she started with anymore. It was buried under layers of noise, hidden behind walls of complicated notes. The soul of the song was suffocating. Frustration bubbled up inside her. She slammed her hand down on the keys, creating a jarring, ugly sound. "This is garbage," she said out loud to the empty room. She stood up and kicked the bench, not caring if she hurt her foot. She felt like a failure. She had taken something beautiful and turned it into a show-off trick. She realized she wasn't writing the music for herself anymore, she was writing it for an imaginary audience of critics. She was trying to prove she was good enough, and in doing so, she had ruined the very thing that made it special. She marched over to the music rack and grabbed the stack of papers. She crumpled them into a ball in her hand, the paper making a satisfying crunching sound. She threw the ball across the room, where it landed in the corner near a pile of dirty laundry. Then she did the same with the other pages. Soon, the floor was covered in sheets of music that represented weeks of hard work. She didn't play the piano for 3 days. It sat in the corner like a dead thing. The lid was closed, hiding the keys. She walked past it a dozen times a day, refusing to even look at it. She spent her time doing normal things, cleaning the kitchen, reading a book, staring out the window at the rain. But the silence in the apartment was loud. It was deafening. Without the music, the apartment felt bigger, but it also felt colder. During those quiet days, her mind began to settle down. The anger faded away and was replaced by a deep sadness. She missed the piano. Not the difficult, stressful version of the piano she had been dealing with, but the friend it used to be. She thought back to that first afternoon, the dust dancing in the light, the simple, sweet melody. She remembered how it felt to play something honest, something that wasn't trying to be anything other than what it was. She realized that she had been trying to force the music to be something it wasn't. She was trying to wear a coat that didn't fit. The simple tune wasn't a soldier in a war, it was a whisper in the dark. By making it so loud and complex, she had betrayed it. On the fourth day, the sun came out for the first time in a while. It streamed through the window and hit the closed lid of the piano, making the dust glow. She walked over and sat on the bench. It felt familiar. She slowly reached out and lifted the lid. The keys looked at her, waiting. She didn't pick up the crumpled papers from the floor. She didn't need them. The music was in her head, and more importantly, it was in her heart. She placed her hands on the keys, but she didn't start with the loud, banging introduction she had written. She started with the melody. Just the melody. She played it softly. One note at a time, she let each note ring out completely before playing the next one. It was the same tune she had found at the beginning, the one that reminded her of childhood. As she played, she felt a lump form in her throat. The simplicity was heartbreaking. It was so pure, so clear. Why had she ever wanted to cover it up? She started to play again, but this time, she listened with new ears. She heard the spaces between the notes. She realized that the silence was just as important as the sound. She had been so afraid of silence that she had filled every second with noise. But now, she understood that the silence gave the music room to breathe. She began to rebuild the piece in her mind, not on paper. She played the melody, and then she added a single bass note to support it. She let that bass note fade away into nothingness before she played the next chord. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't impressive to watch. But it felt right. It felt like she was telling a secret. Tears started to roll down her cheeks, dropping onto her hands and the keys. She didn't wipe them away. She kept playing. She was crying because she was relieved. She realized she didn't have to be a genius composer. She didn't have to write the hardest piece of music in history. She just had to be true to the tune. She had to serve the music, not force it to serve her ego. She spent the rest of the afternoon unlearning everything she had taught herself over the last few months. She stripped away the fancy runs. She deleted the crashing cymbals in her head. She simplified the harmonies, going back to the chords that made her feel something real. It was scary, in a way. It felt vulnerable to play something so simple. It felt like she was standing in front of a crowd without any clothes on, because there was nowhere to hide. If the music was simple, there was nowhere to hide a mistake. As the evening came, she felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. The monster was gone. In its place was something much stronger. It wasn't about showing off anymore. It was about honesty. She knew now that the masterpiece wasn't going to be a tower of noise, it was going to be a clear, still pool of water where you could see your own reflection. She looked at the crumpled balls of paper in the corner and smiled. They belonged to a different person, a person who was trying too hard. She stood up, stretched her fingers, and walked into the kitchen to make dinner. The piano was silent, but it wasn't angry anymore. It was waiting for her to come back and finish what they started, the right way. When she finally sat back down at the piano, the air in the apartment felt different. It was lighter, as if the storm of her frustration had cleared the room and left behind a fresh, clean space. She didn't have a specific plan in her mind, other than to play. She wasn't going to force anything today. She was just going to let her fingers rest on the keys and see what happened. She started with the simple melody again, just like she had done on that very first day. It felt like greeting an old friend. The notes were pure and honest, ringing out clearly in the quiet room. But this time, instead of feeling the urge to immediately bury it under heavy chords, she let the melody stand alone. She let it breathe. She played it through once, and then again, slower. She realized that the silence between the notes was just as important as the notes themselves. The silence was where the feeling lived. As she became comfortable with the quiet, she began to introduce the complicated elements she had worked on before. But she treated them differently now. She didn't throw them at the music like weapons. Instead, she wove them in gently. She took the fast, intricate runs, the spider-like patterns that had caused her so much pain, and she played them softly underneath the melody. They weren't the star of the show anymore, they were the background texture, like the rustling of leaves in the wind while a bird sings. This was the turning point. She finally understood how to balance the two sides of her music. She realized that the masterpiece wasn't about being simple or being complicated. It was about the contrast between the two. The simple tune represented peace and innocence, while the complex, stormy parts represented the chaos of real life. You couldn't have the peace without understanding the chaos. Over the next few weeks, she fell into a rhythm that felt more like meditation than work. Her hands were learning to work together as a team. Her right hand would sing the sweet, high melody, telling the story, while her left hand would create the world around it, sometimes calm, sometimes dangerous. She spent days perfecting a section that moved from a soft whisper to a sudden, loud roar. It was tricky to get right. If she played the loud part too early, it felt like she was yelling. If she waited too long, the music lost its momentum. She practiced that transition hundreds of times. She would play the gentle chords, holding her breath, waiting for the exact right second to release the energy. When she finally got it right, the sound would fill the apartment like a wave crashing over her. It gave her goosebumps every single time. It felt like the piano was talking to her, telling her that she was on the right path. Her physical connection with the instrument changed, too. Before, her hands had been stiff and tight, fighting the keys. Now, they were loose and relaxed. She learned to use the weight of her arms to play the heavy notes instead of just using her small finger muscles. This allowed her to play for hours without getting tired. The music started to flow out of her effortlessly. She stopped looking at the scribbled notes on the paper. She didn't need them anymore. The entire piece was living inside her, in her muscles and her memory. As the piece started to take its final shape, she began to feel a sense of ownership that she had never felt before. This was her music. It didn't sound like Beethoven, and it didn't sound like the songs on the radio. It sounded like her. It had her quirks, her mood swings, and her quiet moments. It was scary to think about sharing it with anyone else because it felt so personal, like letting someone read her diary. But she also knew that a song kept inside a room is like a letter that is never sent. It needed to be heard. She decided to invite a few close friends over. She didn't make a big deal out of it. She just told them she wanted to cook dinner and play something for them. She spent the afternoon cleaning the apartment, making sure everything looked nice. She moved a few chairs into the living room so they could sit and listen comfortably. But as the time for them to arrive got closer, the nerves started to kick in. What if they hated it? What if they thought it was weird or too long? She had poured so much of herself into these notes that if they rejected it, it would feel like they were rejecting her. She paced around the room, straightening pillows that were already straight. She looked at the piano and felt a sudden wave of doubt. Maybe she wasn't ready. When her friends arrived, the apartment filled with the sound of laughter and conversation. They brought wine and dessert, and for a while, it was just a normal, happy evening. But the piano sat in the corner like a silent elephant in the room. Everyone knew she had been working on something, and she could feel the curiosity in the air. Finally, after they had eaten, she took a deep breath. "I'm going to play that piece I've been working on," she said, her voice shaking a little. "It's a bit intense. But I'd love for you to hear it." Her friends put down their glasses and got quiet. She walked over to the piano and sat on the bench. The wood felt cool against her legs. She looked at the keys one last time to ground herself. She closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and then began. She started with the simple tune, just as she had practiced. It was soft and fragile in the large room. She saw her friends lean in, their faces relaxing as the familiar melody washed over them. Then, she slowly introduced the bass notes. The mood shifted. The room felt heavier. She played the section she had struggled with, the one that built up the tension. She watched her friends' expressions change from relaxed to serious. They were listening, really listening. When she hit the loud, stormy climax, the sound was powerful. It vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't just noise, it was an explosion of emotion. She didn't hold back. She let the anger and the passion of the music come out, striking the keys with force. She saw her friend sitting on the edge of the chair, eyes wide, completely captivated. And then, just as quickly as the storm had arrived, she pulled back. She returned to the simple, quiet melody. It wasn't exactly the same as the beginning, it was wiser now. It had been through the storm and survived. She played the final notes, letting them hang in the air for a long time before she lifted her hands off the keys and placed them in her lap. The room was completely silent. For a few seconds, nobody moved. She sat there, her heart pounding in her chest, terrified that the silence meant they didn't like it. But then, she looked at her friend closest to her and saw a tear rolling down her cheek. The silence broke slowly, not with polite clapping, but with a deep, collective exhale. One of her friends just whispered, "Wow." Another one got up and came over to hug her. She didn't know what to say. She just sat there and accepted the hug, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. "I've never heard anything like that," her friend said, wiping her eyes. "It felt like you were telling a story without using any words." I don't know, I felt everything." She smiled, and for the first time in months, the smile reached her eyes. She realized then that the long nights, the frustration, the crumpled papers, and the doubt were all worth it. She had taken a simple tune and turned it into something that could touch another human being. That was the real magic. It wasn't about being a genius. It was about being honest. And as she looked around the room at her friends, she knew that the piece was finally finished. It was no longer just a draft or a work in progress. It was a masterpiece, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. The word about her music spread faster than she expected. After that evening with her friends, one of them happened to mention the piece to a local organizer who was putting together a community showcase for local artists. It wasn't a sold-out concert at a huge symphony hall, and there wouldn't be any fancy tuxedos or evening gowns in the audience. It was just a small event in the neighborhood, held in a modest building that usually hosted town meetings and dance classes. But to her, it felt like the most important stage in the world. In the week leading up to the performance, a strange quiet settled over her. The obsessive practicing, the endless rewriting, and the frantic energy of the past few months had vanished. The piece was done. She knew it note for note, breath for breath. Now, she just had to wait. She spent her days walking around the city, listening to the rhythm of the street noises, and wondering how the audience would react. She felt a mix of terrifying anxiety and a calm sort of readiness. She knew that she couldn't make the music any better by sitting at the piano, she just had to trust it. On the night of the show, the air outside was crisp and cool. She carried her sheet music in a simple black folder, though she doubted she would need to look at it. When she walked into the building, the smell of old wood and floor wax greeted her. The atmosphere was buzzing with low chatter and the shuffling of chairs. People of all ages were finding their seats: elderly couples, students with backpacks, parents holding the hands of sleepy children. Backstage, or rather, behind a heavy velvet curtain in the corner of the room, she peeked out at the piano. It was a grand piano, much larger and shinier than her dusty upright at home. It sat alone under a single spotlight, looking majestic and a little intimidating. The lid was propped open, ready to sing. She felt a flutter in her stomach, a swarm of nervous butterflies. What if the keys were too stiff? What if the pedals were different? What if the magic she felt in her living apartment didn't exist in this cold, open room? The host of the evening called her name. The chatter in the room died down. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her shirt, and walked out into the light. The walk to the piano felt longer than it actually was. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, dozens of faces turning to watch. She didn't look at anyone specifically, she just focused on the bench. She sat down, adjusted the height, and flexed her fingers. The piano smelled like lemon polish and history. She reached out her foot to find the sustain pedal. It was stiff, but it would work. She placed her hands on the keys. The silence in the room was heavy. It was the kind of silence where you could hear a pin drop. For a moment, she felt a flash of panic. Who was she to think she could captivate these people? But then she remembered the simple tune. She remembered the afternoon sun hitting the dust in her apartment. She remembered the feeling of discovering the melody for the first time. She closed her eyes for just a second, blocking out the audience, the spotlight, and the fear. She was back in her living room. She began to play. The first few notes were soft, barely a whisper. The grand piano carried the sound much farther than her upright, filling every corner of the hall. The simple melody floated out, delicate and clear. She played it exactly as she had written it in the beginning. No tricks, no flash. Just the pure, honest tune. She saw the audience lean in. The restless shifting stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath. She was telling them a secret, and they were listening. As she moved into the middle section, the music began to change. She introduced the harmonies she had struggled with, the ones that created tension. Her left hand played a steady, heartbeat rhythm, while her right hand wove complex patterns above it. She wasn't hitting the keys with force anymore, she was playing with intent. The music swelled, growing louder and more intense. The notes clashed and resolved, creating waves of sound that washed over the people in the chairs. She felt a strange sensation take over. It wasn't stage fright anymore, it was a connection. She could feel the audience with her. When the music was tense, the room felt tense. When she released a dissonant chord into a beautiful major one, she could almost feel the collective relaxation of the crowd. She wasn't performing at them, she was taking them on a journey. Then came the climax, the stormy part she had fought so hard to master. She let her hands fly. The piano roared. The sound was huge and dramatic, filling the high ceilings of the hall. She put her whole body into it, swaying slightly with the rhythm, feeling the vibration of the strings through the bench. It wasn't noise anymore, it was a release of all the doubt, all the fear, and all the hard work she had poured into the piece. It was powerful, but it was controlled. She guided the chaos like a captain steering a ship through a storm. And then, just as the intensity reached its peak, she pulled back. The transition was sudden. The roaring waves of sound receded, leaving behind the quiet, simple melody once again. It was the same tune she started with, but it sounded different now. It sounded wiser. It had been through the storm and survived. She played it slowly, letting each note ring out into the silence. The spotlight felt warm on her hands. She could hear a few sniffles in the audience. She played the final chord. She didn't lift her hands immediately. She held the chord, letting the sound fade into nothingness, waiting until the last vibration of the string disappeared into the air. Only then did she lift her hands and place them gently in her lap. For a second, there was still silence. It was that magical moment after a great performance where the audience needs a few seconds to come back to reality. Then, a clap broke the quiet. Then another. Then suddenly, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was genuine appreciation. People were smiling, some were wiping tears, and others were looking at each other in amazement. She stood up and turned to face the room. The spotlight made it hard to see faces clearly, but she could feel the warmth coming from them. She bowed deeply, feeling a rush of gratitude wash over her. She wasn't bowing because she thought she was a genius. She was bowing because she was thankful that she had been brave enough to share her truth. As she walked off the stage, her legs felt a little shaky, but her heart was full. Back in the quiet of the hallway, away from the lights and the noise, she leaned against the wall and let out a long breath. She did it. She had taken a simple tune, a fragment of a melody she found while dusting, and she had turned it into something that touched the hearts of strangers. Driving home that night, the city lights blurred past her windows. The radio was off, and the car was silent. She realized that the masterpiece wasn't just the music she had played. The masterpiece was the journey she had taken to get there. It was the late nights, the frustration, the crumbling of paper, and the courage to start over. She had learned that she didn't need to be someone else to create art, she just needed to be herself. When she walked back into her apartment, the upright piano was sitting in the corner, waiting for her in the dark. She walked over and sat on the bench. It felt small now compared to the grand piano at the hall, but it felt like home. She didn't play the masterpiece. She didn't need to. She just ran her fingers over the keys, listening to the mechanical clink of the hammers. She smiled in the dark. She knew that she would never look at a simple tune the same way again. She knew that hidden inside the smallest ideas, there are masterpieces waiting to be found by anyone willing to listen.